When Vincent Romano became New York's most reliable taxi driver, passengers trusted him to get them home safely. But when his heroin addiction and human trafficking connections consumed him, he began kidnapping lone riders and murdering witnesses, turning cab rides into one-way trips to terror and death. Before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now let's get back to the video. The neon lights of Manhattan reflected off the rain-soaked streets as Vincent Romano adjusted his rearview mirror and prepared his taxi for what would become the most dangerous fare of his 19-year career as New York City's most experienced independent cab driver and transportation specialist. At 53 years old, Vincent had established himself as the city's most dependable taxi operator, specializing in late-night pickups and airport transportation that attracted wealthy business travelers, international visitors, and prominent residents who valued his discretion about their destinations and his reputation for safe, reliable service through the most dangerous neighborhoods of the 5 boroughs. Vincent's taxi operation consisted of a fleet of 3 well-maintained Crown Victoria vehicles that he personally inspected and serviced to ensure optimal performance during the demanding conditions of New York street driving. His regular clientele included Wall Street executives who required early morning airport runs, entertainment industry professionals who needed discreet transportation to private meetings, and wealthy tourists who paid premium rates for his knowledge of the city's hidden restaurants, exclusive clubs, and off-the-beaten-path destinations that only longtime residents knew about. The interior of Vincent's primary taxi reflected his commitment to professional service and his understanding of discerning passengers' expectations for comfort and privacy during their travels, featuring leather seats, advanced GPS navigation systems, and soundproofing modifications that allowed clients to conduct confidential phone conversations while traveling to sensitive business meetings or personal appointments. His dashboard displayed his taxi license, commercial driving certifications, and testimonials from grateful passengers who had relied on his services during emergencies and important occasions. But beneath Vincent's reputation for reliable transportation lay a dangerous combination of heroin addiction, human trafficking operations, and systematic murder that had transformed his taxi into a mobile prison where unsuspecting passengers and threatening investigators met their fate through kidnapping, assault, and deliberate crashes staged as accidents. "Good evening, Vincent," said Catherine Morrison, his 11 o'clock pickup and a 47-year-old federal prosecutor whose late-night departure from the courthouse required transportation to her Upper East Side apartment following a high-profile organized crime trial that had lasted past normal court hours. Catherine had been using Vincent's taxi service for over 2 years, trusting him not only with her transportation needs, but also with knowledge of her work schedule and home address that made her vulnerable to targeted attacks by criminal organizations seeking to eliminate key witnesses and prosecutors. "Good evening, Ms. Morrison," Vincent replied, with the professional reliability and street knowledge that had made him legendary among New York's legal and business communities who viewed him as both driver and confidant, capable of navigating the city's complex traffic patterns while maintaining absolute discretion about his passengers' identities and destinations. "I'll have you home safely in about 20 minutes, depending on the traffic situation around the bridge construction. I've been monitoring the traffic reports to ensure we take the fastest route possible." Catherine had become Vincent's most dangerous passenger, not because of her demanding transportation requirements or her high-profile legal work, but because of her recent prosecution of human trafficking cases that had connected to Vincent's criminal network and her growing awareness of the systematic kidnapping and murder operations that he had been conducting while using his taxi service as cover for organized crime activities. What Catherine didn't know was that Vincent had been systematically kidnapping passengers and murdering witnesses for over 4 years, using his taxi driver expertise and access to isolated locations throughout the city to eliminate targeted victims whose disappearances could be attributed to the random dangers of urban life. Vincent's transformation from legitimate taxi driver to calculating killer had begun 6 years earlier, when his heroin addiction had escalated from occasional recreational use to daily dependency that consumed his taxi earnings and forced him into dangerous relationships with organized crime figures who controlled New York's drug distribution networks. His addiction had grown to cost over $400 per day, while his mounting debts to drug dealers had exceeded $200,000 with criminal organizations, demanding that he use his taxi service to facilitate their human trafficking and kidnapping operations. Faced with threats of violence against his family and potential exposure of his drug addiction to taxi licensing authorities, Vincent had agreed to allow his taxi operation to be used as a front for human trafficking networks that transported kidnapped victims and smuggled individuals through the city's extensive transportation system, where his legitimate taxi license provided cover for criminal activities. His criminal activities had escalated when several passengers had witnessed suspicious activities during their rides and had threatened to report their observations to law enforcement agencies investigating human trafficking operations. Vincent had murdered his first victim, a businessman who had observed evidence of kidnapping activities, by staging a fatal car accident during what appeared to be a routine taxi ride through a dangerous neighborhood known for vehicular crime. The success of his first murder had convinced Vincent that eliminating threatening passengers and suspicious investigators was both necessary for protecting his trafficking operation and relatively easy to accomplish, given his knowledge of the city's most dangerous areas and his ability to stage deaths as random urban violence. Over the following 4 years, Vincent had murdered 14 additional individuals using various methods that took advantage of his intimate knowledge of New York's geography, his access to isolated locations throughout the 5 boroughs, and his victims' trust in his professional transportation services and street expertise. His victims had been carefully selected based on their discovery of trafficking activities, their potential threat to his criminal operations, and their traveling patterns that made them vulnerable to targeted attacks during supposedly routine taxi rides. His victims had included Dr. Patricia Williams, a social worker who had been investigating human trafficking patterns and whose taxi ride had ended in fatal carbon monoxide poisoning from deliberately modified exhaust systems. Jennifer Martinez, a journalist who had been researching organized crime transportation networks and whose cab had been deliberately crashed into the East River during what appeared to be an accident, and David Foster, a federal immigration agent who had been tracking trafficking routes and whose taxi ride had resulted in fatal assault staged as a carjacking in a high crime area. "Vincent, I need to discuss some serious concerns about missing persons cases and reports of human trafficking activities connected to your taxi service," said Detective Maria Rodriguez of the NYPD's Human Trafficking Unit as she flagged down Vincent's cab during his regular route through the financial district. Detective Rodriguez specialized in investigating human trafficking operations and had developed expertise in recognizing how criminal organizations exploited legitimate transportation services to conceal their illegal activities and eliminate potential witnesses. Detective Rodriguez's investigation represented an existential threat to Vincent's criminal operation, as her law enforcement expertise and access to trafficking databases could expose the systematic kidnapping operations and connect him to multiple missing persons cases throughout the city. "Of course, Detective Rodriguez," Vincent replied, though he felt the familiar surge of anxiety and aggression that accompanied any official scrutiny of his taxi operations by law enforcement officers who possessed the training and resources to detect evidence of human trafficking and systematic murder disguised as random urban crime or transportation accidents. "Passenger safety and legal compliance are always my highest priorities, and I want to cooperate with any investigation that might help protect riders and ensure that taxi services operate according to all applicable safety and licensing regulations." Detective Rodriguez consulted detailed reports from missing persons investigations and human trafficking task forces that showed patterns of disappearances and suspicious activities involving taxi pickups and destinations that suggested systematic criminal coordination rather than random urban crime or coincidental transportation incidents. "Vincent, I've been investigating reports of missing persons and human trafficking activities that appear to be connected to taxi services operating in your area," Detective Rodriguez said, with the investigative expertise that had made her successful in solving complex trafficking cases. 14 individuals have disappeared after being picked up by taxi services matching your vehicle description and license number, with several witnesses reporting suspicious activities involving drivers who were transporting additional passengers who appeared to be held against their will. The detective's identification of the trafficking patterns and her recognition of the connection between taxi services and disappearances confirmed Vincent's worst fears that his criminal activities had been analyzed and connected to his legitimate taxi operation and systematic elimination of witnesses and threatening passengers. Vincent's response was swift and deadly, as he realized that eliminating Detective Rodriguez was essential for protecting his criminal enterprise and preventing exposure of his systematic trafficking and murder operations. "Detective Rodriguez, I think there may be some misunderstanding about normal taxi operations and the reality that many passengers traveling through dangerous neighborhoods face risks from random crime that have nothing to do with legitimate taxi services," Vincent said, while discreetly reaching for a modified tire iron that he kept hidden under his driver's seat for emergency elimination of law enforcement threats. "Perhaps we could discuss these concerns while I drive you to the precinct where you can file your reports. I can explain the routes and neighborhoods that might help clarify these apparent coincidences while ensuring you reach your destination safely." Detective Rodriguez agreed to continue their conversation during the ride, not realizing that the taxi driver was planning to drive her to an isolated location where previous murders had been committed and where Vincent intended to kill her using his modified tire iron during what would appear to be a carjacking or random assault rather than deliberate murder by a trafficking operator protecting his criminal network. Vincent's plan involved driving Detective Rodriguez to a secluded area under the pretense of avoiding traffic congestion, then using his tire iron to assault her while staging the scene to appear as a random violent crime that occurred during a taxi ride through a dangerous neighborhood known for attacks on law enforcement officers. But Vincent's carefully planned murder of the detective was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of federal agents who had been investigating human trafficking networks and had identified connections to his taxi operation. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's Human Trafficking Division had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into organized human smuggling and trafficking operations that used legitimate transportation services to move victims through urban areas without attracting law enforcement attention. Agent Torres specialized in investigating trafficking networks that exploited taxi and transportation services and had developed expertise in tracking criminal organizations that used legitimate drivers and vehicles to conceal their illegal activities. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from multiple law enforcement agencies and social service organizations who had noticed patterns of missing persons and trafficking indicators that suggested organized criminal networks were using taxi services to transport victims while eliminating potential witnesses to their operations. Agent Torres had been conducting surveillance of Vincent's taxi operations and had documented evidence of systematic human trafficking, witness elimination, and suspicious passenger activities that suggested his transportation services were being used for organized criminal activity rather than legitimate taxi operations. "Vincent Romano, I'm Special Agent Torres with the FBI," he announced as he approached Vincent's taxi where the driver was preparing to murder Detective Rodriguez. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of human trafficking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic exploitation of taxi services for criminal trafficking operations and elimination of potential witnesses." Vincent's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of street aggression and desperate attempts to maintain his taxi driver persona, as he realized that law enforcement agencies at multiple levels had been investigating his trafficking activities and had connected them to systematic witness elimination and murder. His carefully maintained reputation as a reliable taxi driver had failed to protect him from comprehensive investigation by agencies with expertise in human trafficking and organized crime. Special Agent Torres, there must be some serious misunderstanding about legitimate taxi operations and the normal business activities required for providing transportation services in a dangerous city where passengers face risks from random crime, Vincent said frantically, while abandoning his plan to murder Detective Rodriguez and attempting to preserve some semblance of professional credibility, despite the overwhelming evidence against his criminal activities. I am a licensed taxi driver with 19 years of experience providing safe transportation for New York's business community and international visitors. All of my taxi operations comply with established safety regulations and licensing requirements designed to protect passengers while providing reliable transportation services throughout the 5 boroughs. Detective Rodriguez looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the taxi driver she had been investigating for trafficking connections. Her human trafficking investigation had not only exposed Vincent's systematic kidnapping and murder operation, but it also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who had been using taxi services as cover for systematic elimination of witnesses and law enforcement threats. The comprehensive investigation that followed Vincent's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods he had developed to exploit taxi services for systematic human trafficking and murder. Forensic analysis of Vincent's taxi fleet revealed extensive evidence of his trafficking operations, including hidden compartments for transporting victims, sophisticated surveillance equipment for monitoring passengers and law enforcement, and detailed records showing coordination between taxi pickups and trafficking activities. His vehicles contained restraint devices, drugging equipment, and detailed profiles of passengers who had been targeted for kidnapping and murder based on their potential threat to criminal operations. The investigation also uncovered Vincent's connections to international trafficking organizations that had been using his taxi services as a transportation hub for moving victims throughout the Northeast Corridor. His criminal network included corrupt taxi dispatchers who had provided information about vulnerable passengers and dishonest law enforcement contacts who had helped cover up evidence of systematic trafficking and murder. Most disturbing was the discovery of Vincent's detailed knowledge of New York's geography and crime patterns, which he had used to identify optimal locations for disposing of victims while staging deaths to appear as random urban violence rather than targeted murders connected to organized trafficking operations. Vincent Romano was ultimately convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder, systematic human trafficking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, conspiracy to commit organized criminal enterprise activities, and numerous other charges related to his exploitation of taxi services for criminal trafficking operations and elimination of potential witnesses. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout New York's taxi and transportation industry, prompting immediate reforms in driver licensing, passenger protection protocols, and trafficking prevention measures designed to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation by trusted transportation professionals. Several other taxi drivers and transportation services were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of transportation services and new requirements for background screening and ongoing monitoring that made it more difficult for criminal organizations to exploit legitimate transportation businesses for trafficking and murder operations. Detective Rodriguez and Special Agent Torres received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in transportation crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying trafficking operations and protecting passengers from exploitation by criminal transportation providers. Catherine Morrison and other surviving passengers required extensive security consultations and psychological counseling to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted taxi driver had been systematically kidnapping passengers and murdering witnesses while using his transportation services for organized criminal activities. The taxi industry implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect passengers from exploitation by unethical drivers. The case prompted comprehensive changes in taxi industry regulation, including mandatory background checks for all taxi drivers, enhanced oversight of taxi operations, real-time GPS monitoring of all taxi rides, and new reporting procedures for suspicious transportation activities involving passenger safety or potential trafficking indicators. Vincent's conviction also led to increased cooperation between transportation industry organizations and law enforcement agencies investigating human trafficking, with new protocols designed to identify taxi and transportation services that might be exploiting their legitimate operations for systematic criminal activities while eliminating potential witnesses. the taxi and broader transportation industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced security protocols for passenger protection, comprehensive driver screening programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious transportation activities, and improved training for recognizing signs of human trafficking and passenger endangerment in transportation settings. 5 years after Vincent's conviction and life imprisonment, New York's taxi community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect passengers from drivers who might abuse their positions of trust in transportation authority for criminal purposes. The taxi driver who had promised to provide safe and reliable transportation through the dangerous streets of New York had instead used his street knowledge and vehicle access to commit systematic human trafficking and murder, while exploiting passengers' trust and vulnerability during late-night rides through the city. However, his crimes had been thoroughly exposed, and his victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept missing passenger cases as mere urban disappearances. Vincent Romano's last ride had ended at the gates of permanent imprisonment, where he would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even transportation professionals who attempted to exploit their street access for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent passengers from predatory taxi drivers. The taxi driver's last ride had reached its final destination of justice, serving as a lasting reminder that those entrusted with safe passage through dangerous streets must never abuse that trust, and that transportation professionals who would exploit passenger vulnerability for criminal gain will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of public safety and human decency. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.